Hi everyone, and welcome back to my third video in my Tarot for Beginners series. Today we're going to talk about some basic ways to read tarot, different techniques that you can use to elevate your reading practice. The first thing to consider is what type of spread you will use. Now, you can either have a structured tarot spread or you can have a freeform tarot spread. I usually recommend that beginning tarot readers start with structured tarot spread. It helps you to get a sense of what the different cards might be saying and how they might relate to other cards in the reading. One of the simplest spreads you can use is a 3-card spread. I like to do past, present, and future. You could also do 3-card spreads like mind, body, spirit, myself, another person, the relationship. So there are a lot of possibilities when you're drawing 3 cards. When you have 3 cards, you can then see the relationship between each card. How, say if you have the Death card next to the Devil, right, that really amplifies the meaning, as opposed to, say, having the Death card next to the Two of Wands would have a really different meaning. The Celtic Cross is a spread that a lot of people use. It's not my favorite, mainly just because I don't actually use a lot of structured tarot spreads, but plenty of people use it. It's a great one for beginners because it helps you to start somewhere, right? And so you can easily find lots of videos on the Celtic Cross. I'm not going to go over it in depth here. I'm going to talk more about, not as much about spread design, but more about actual reading techniques. Most tarot booklets will also come with a few spread designs that the creator of the deck has made and thinks would be beneficial to use with this deck. Most structured spreads will assign each card a position, right? They'll say like, this card represents your love life, this card represents you in 10 years, this card represents your family, right? So each card is like shuffled into a place, like this is the meaning that we're assigning to it, and then we use the actual card itself to determine what it is that the deck is trying to tell us about that particular area of someone's life or that aspect or element that we've assigned it to. This is definitely helpful, especially for new readers. Plenty of people love structured spreads and use them when they're very experienced, and I like them too, but there are other ways to do things that I actually prefer more. So I like to use freeform tarot spreads. Rachel Pollack, whose book I referenced in one of my previous videos, she does a technique where she'll actually have the client kind of say what's going on, and she will actually just essentially assign positions of a spread based on what the client says. So if the client's like, I'm really sad because I think my wife wants to leave me, and my kids don't love me anymore. And she'll like take each one of those things and like place a card down for it. I really like that method, only it's really hard for me to like actually remember all that. So I kind of do it a little bit differently because it's hard for me to remember what I would have just randomly assigned each card. But that's certainly another way that you can do things. The way that I usually read is I will typically assign cards in groups of 3. I will lay them out, and then I will intuitively discern what I feel like each triad of cards is trying to talk about. Sometimes I will assign a specific topic, like, this row is the present, this next row is 1 month from now, but I try to keep it as open-ended because I like allowing the cards to tell me what's going on rather than me telling the cards what's going on. So that's just how I like to do it. I keep it more freeform, but that's not right or wrong. I think there are so many different ways to read tarot, and I would encourage you to try out some different types of spreads or freeform structures and see what works best for you. So the first tool I want to talk about is the funnel. I finally got some of these. I've been trying to make ghee, and it's really hard at the end to like get the ghee in filtered, and so I finally got a funnel. But the idea behind the funnel in a tarot reading, right, is that we're trying to move from the mundane, from the surface level, down deeper into the spiritual layer or the psychological layer. And so we're thinking of funneling what the querent brings to us. We're distilling it into something essential, something, some insight, some knowledge, some kernel that they can take with them when they leave the reading and go back out into the world. To achieve this, I will generally use multiple decks in the course of a reading. It helps me sort of filter through the layers a little bit, and I will start usually with a larger number of cards, and then I'll use like an oracle deck and like an animal guide deck, and I will slowly kind of narrow it down to smaller numbers of cards. I find that, the same themes usually like come back throughout the layers, and that using the layers helps to better distill the thing that we're working on together in the session. You could do this through your spread design, right? You could create kind of a funnel through the positions that you created the cards. There are a lot of different ways to do this, but the idea is that, we're slowly moving inward. And that's how I read. And some tarot readers aren't necessarily into the psychological, spiritual level of things. So then I guess this might not apply, but this is how I like to do it. My goal is to always to go a bit deeper. I think one of the benefits to the funnel is that it really allows for an organic process where the client is oftentimes coming to these realizations on their own when they're in the funnel, as opposed to me just like sitting down and telling them like, hey, this is what's up. And sometimes I have to do that too, but it's really nice. I think a realization is going to stick much more if the person has it themselves, as opposed to you just like giving it to them. Right. And I see this as well in my work as a therapist, where like if I can just tell people like, here's your top 5 problems, right? But until they really come to understand that on their own and really experientially like have knowledge of that, it's really not going to mean a whole lot. So the structure of the session can actually be set up to help people sort of like inception them into like understanding what's going on. The second tool I like to use is called the golden thread. And I don't have any gold thread, I'm sorry. So this goes back to the funnel where we're looking for common themes, right? As you go through the reading, understanding, what is emerging as the golden thread? What is the theme that we can focus on? Is there something that keeps coming up over and over and over again? It's kind of like the deck is saying like, hey, pay attention to this. Oh yeah, did you see? It's still here. And sometimes like you'll do that thing, right? Where you're like, you do a reading with one deck and you don't like the answer, right? And then you go do the reading with a different deck and you get the same answer. It's that golden thread, just like somehow weaves its way on through whatever it is that we're doing. Some techniques that you can use to help people see the golden thread, summarization is a big one. So like as you're moving through the reading, periodically summarizing the parts that you've seen come back up repeatedly. So I can see through this reading that vulnerability keeps coming up as something that there's a lot of fear around, and it seems like the cards keep talking about the rewards that happen when we're able to step into that vulnerability, and that, if you can make that happen, that some good things will come out of that. So all of this definitely requires that you pay a lot of attention. So you have to be keeping a close eye on what's emerging both in the deck, also in the client, and what associations that you are having, because those often will be indicative. They'll be connected to all the different stuff that's going on in the room. So you can use your own intuitions, your own associations, oftentimes to guide the process. It's important to really pay attention to the relationship between cards. This is how you really learn how to go deeper, is by seeing that's why I like to do cards in threes, right? Because then I can see more concretely what relationship is happening between the cards, and it gives me a lot of detailed information. So for instance, if I had the Lovers, the Seven of Swords, and the Ace of Swords, we might be able to talk about maybe there's a situation where someone's having an affair and they're about to get found out, right? There could be a lot of possibilities, but as these cards group together, it tells a really different story than if we look at the cards separately. And sometimes if I'm trying to figure out whether the shadow side of a card, or what specific element of this card is trying to be heard, right? Noticing what cards are around it really helps to guide my decision in that process. So to summarize, the golden thread is all about finding those common themes. We can help the client discover those by using summarization techniques, by reflecting back to them the things that we're seeing over and over again. We have to really pay attention, and we also need to become aware of the relationships between cards in our spread. It's also important to think of how we ask questions, right? The first one being, how do we ask a question to the cards? So I don't even always have people necessarily pose a super specific question. Oftentimes we'll just do a more general reading, and I find that the important issues come out anyway. I think where we get into trouble, right, is if a client has a really specific question and they're not asking in a way that's conducive to tarot. So for instance, yes or no questions generally are a no-go, right? It's really hard for the deck to offer much insight when we're limiting it by saying tell us either yes or no, right? So it's usually helpful to have the person start out either generally or have them kind of pick an area to focus on, something that they're curious about. That can be like, I'm curious about my love life. I'm curious about what I'm supposed to be doing with my life right now, as opposed to like, what's going to happen next Friday, right? When we hone in really specifically, we don't leave space for the process to work. We don't leave space for the unexpected to happen. So once we get kind of an established question or general direction to point us into, right, then we actually need to think about what questions we're asking for the querent. So there are two main kinds of questions: open-ended questions and closed questions. So closed questions are questions that can be answered by yes or no. So like, are you tall? Do you have blue eyes? Do you like hamburgers, right? Those are all closed questions. Sometimes it's useful. There are certain instances where, it's like, are you free Friday night, right? That's a good example of where we would use a closed question. If we're asking, what should we do Friday night, right? We don't want to close it up by saying, well, like, do you want to go bowling, right? Because then it really limits the conversation, because then we're only talking about bowling. So closed-ended questions should be used sparingly, right? There may be instances in a reading where you need to ask a closed-ended question, but in general, if we're trying to explore, if we're trying to broaden, we don't want to ask a yes or no question, because that will only limit what's in the room. Open-ended questions are questions that start with things like what or how or why. So like, why is the sky blue? What is my purpose in life? Open-ended questions help us explore uncharted territory. They allow us to broaden the vision as opposed to honing in on something specific, right? They're very exploratory, which in a tarot reading is often very helpful. Often we're trying to kind of budge open so we can see from a different vantage point. So if you are trying to explore something with a querent, I would suggest using primarily open-ended questions. So don't ask yes or no questions. Ask questions that are really going to help that person to dig deeper. This also applies if you're giving homework to querents, like if you're giving them journaling prompts or things to fill out. Really think about asking them a question that's going to broaden rather than narrow. Another technique that you can use is reflective listening. So this is a counseling technique, but truly it can be useful in any kind of conversation, including tarot readings. So this is when you hear what someone has to say, you take it in, and then you reflect back to them what it is that you've heard. So it's allowing you to clarify, like, so this is what I'm hearing from you, and then they can affirm or, disagree or say, no, I don't think you quite understand what I'm saying. So it helps us to make sure that we are on the same page when we're talking to someone. So if someone, is in a reading and they're like expressing that they're really frustrated with something, maybe their job has been really difficult lately, I might reflect back to them like, wow, it seems like work has been a huge struggle lately and you feel really overwhelmed with that. And then they might be like, yes, oh my God. And they might be like, oh no, it's tough, but it's not really that bad. So then it helps you to gauge how well you're seeing what's going on for them. Reflective listening is also really helpful when you're dealing with charged material. So if someone is saying something that you maybe disagree with, like they have a different political belief than you, or there's conflict, maybe they've hurt you in some way, right? Reflective listening can be a great way to show that person, hey, I'm here in this conversation, without necessarily indicating that you agree or disagree with them. It's saying like, hey, I'm here, I hear what you're saying. And sometimes when we feel heard, it helps us to de-escalate things a little bit, and so it can help create more connection, build more rapport. Another thing we can look at doing is called normalization. So this is when someone comes in, they have some kind of problem, and they're like, oh my God, this is the worst problem. No one has ever suffered like me. No one could possibly understand what I'm going through. I'm such a freak. I'm a monster, right? It's where we feel like whatever it is that we're going through, that no one else knows that we're sort of like uniquely horrible in some way, that we're just really awful because we're dealing with this thing that no one else could possibly have dealt with before. I think it's helpful in those situations to point out hey, that really sucks. And a lot of other people are dealing with that. It's okay. It's normal, right? We can say, yeah, maybe you've had that struggle too, right? And you can normalize in that way. Normalization can be really powerful. I think the internet has played a big role in this. When people are dealing with unique gender identities, sexual orientations, right? Knowing wow, there's thousands of other people like me that are having a similar experience. It's very, very validating. So it's possible in a tarot reading to also provide that kind of validation and normalization. right? Humans, we just want to know that that we belong, that we fit in somewhere, and we can play that role as tarot readers, assuring people yes, this is a part of the human experience. In general, I think it's important that we facilitate rather than tell. And this isn't a blanket edict. I just think that, like I said before, that when people have realizations on their own, it's usually much more powerful than when we just hand them that information. And so it's facilitating them through an experience that leads them to further insight that is transformative, as opposed to just handing out information, right? There's a difference between the two. And I think that's the power of tarot, right? Is that we're not just handing information, we're setting up an experience that involves connecting with another person, connecting with visual images and intuitive associations that then leads to transformation. I also like to think of tarot as storytelling, right? So I make use of a lot of metaphor and simile. I'll make associations to characters in books or TV shows or movies. I think it's helpful when we can really connect with the material that's coming up, that we can really make it real for someone. Similarly, I'll just ask people hey, do you have any associations to this card, right? Sometimes they'll be oh, I don't like this card, or this card reminds me of my mother, or something, or oh, when I see this card, it makes me feel really emotional, I feel really sad. And so those are all important things that we can utilize to explore. It's not an accident if someone's having an intense association to a card. And I think it's really worth asking your clients hey, what do you see? Here's what I see, and what do you see? Another thing to keep in mind is that you want to try to sort of mirror the other person. So if they come into their reading and they're super sad and their energy is super down, right? You probably don't want to be super chipper and energetic. You want to kind of tone it down, meet them where they're at, and reflect that back to them. It doesn't mean you have to cry or be sad. It just energetically, you want to kind of be attuned to the state that they're in when they see you, and do your best to kind of meet them in that state. One great place to start is actually just explaining to people sort of the traditional meanings of the cards, right? So, Six of Swords comes up and you're sometimes Six of Swords is about a journey, it can be about transitions, right? And oftentimes that will sort of open the conversation, people will have associations, and you can get the ball rolling. And if people aren't familiar with tarot decks, right, they may not understand, oh, swords is associated with the element of air, or, the importance of a trump card. They may not know any of that. So I'll often provide some basic education as I'm going through the deck of what do the different suits have to do with, what does this card mean? Because people don't have that same knowledge always that we do. And so sometimes when we share that, it helps them to see what we're seeing as we go through the deck. So there are a lot of different ways to read tarot. There are a lot of different techniques you can use. I just tried to give you a few basic things so that when you get into a reading, you're not just what do I even say to them? You have some ideas, you have some ways, conversation starters, things to get the ball rolling. And as you practice these different techniques, they'll become more comfortable, and you'll figure out what your style is, and you'll find techniques that really resonate. So don't be afraid to experiment, because ultimately that's how you're going to learn. At the end of the day, the power of tarot really comes from connection. And so if you do nothing else, being there to listen to another human being and witness their story is very powerful, and don't underestimate what that might mean to someone. Have fun with your readings. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks. See you next time.